Good afternoon and good morning to those on the West Coast. I'm Jill Smith of the Genesis Prize Foundation, and the foundation, along with 70 Faces Media, is pleased to welcome you to an important conversation among 3 of the 10 grantees of the Initiative for Racial and Economic Justice in honor of our 2021 laureate, Steven Spielberg. I'm delighted to welcome my partner in this work, Shana Triebwasser, the executive director of the Righteous Persons Foundation, which is one of the foundations funded by Kate Capshaw and Steven Spielberg. Shana will introduce our moderator for today. Shana?
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you, Jill. I want to begin by just sharing my gratitude for the Genesis Prize Foundation and for 70 Faces Media for hosting today's event. The Righteous Persons Foundation is incredibly proud to support the Jews of Color Initiative, the Religious Action Center, and Avodah. So we are thrilled to have the spotlight placed over their extraordinary work and leaders. I have the privilege, as Jill mentioned, of introducing Megan Black, who will be moderating today's conversation. I first encountered Megan in a synagogue in 2018. She was surrounded, literally, by a group of multi-faith organizers who had come together, most of them hesitantly, to have a conversation about anti-Semitism, racism, and the rising threat of white nationalism. Megan was facilitating, and I was blown away. As you'll see, Megan brings an abundance of both subject matter expertise and humanity to her work. Much of what I experienced in that room, in that one conversation, has stayed with me, and it continues to inform the Righteous Persons Foundation's approach to combating anti-Semitism and hate in all of its forms. Megan grew up in the Midwest, earned her undergraduate degree from the University of Notre Dame, has a Master of Divinity from Vanderbilt, and she lives in Kansas City. She's been a social justice activist since 2010 and has worked with organizations including Interfaith Youth Corps, Faith in Action, and Western State Center, where she is currently the director of the Common Good program. I'm so excited for you all to hear from her and all of our panelists. So let's get to it.
Thank you, Shana. I'm really grateful for you. It's really, really wonderful to be here in honor of this year's Genesis Prize laureate, Steven Spielberg, and the generous donation that he and Kate Capshaw made to 10 very well-deserved organizations that are dedicated to advancing racial justice and building an equitable world. And I'm particularly thrilled to be here moderating this conversation with leaders from 3 of those organizations, people who are some of my own personal heroes in the world of racial justice. I'm excited to introduce them now, and then we'll begin our conversation and really try to take advantage of the time that we have. I'll be moderating, and I have questions and topics for this. We also welcome your comments and questions in the chat, and we'll try to incorporate them as we have time, and we'll hit the ground running. So I'll start by introducing Cheryl Cook, who is the Chief Executive Director of Avodah. With 30 years of experience working across the Jewish community, Cheryl is passionate about developing the next generation of Jewish social justice leaders. Cheryl has overseen some of the organization's most successful national growth strategies, including expansion of the leadership programs to new cities, the creation of innovative models to elevate Jewish justice voices, and bringing educational resources and conversations into the Jewish community to strengthen our work on racial and social justice and poverty in the US. Prior to Avodah, Cheryl served for 9 years as Chief Operating Officer of Hazon, am I saying that right? I hope so, where she played a vital role in guiding the organization through an era of significant growth. She has worked across the Jewish community for her career at Jesna, at New Israel Fund, Hillel of Greater Philadelphia, and at the 92nd Street. She has participated in the Sela Leadership Program, Advancing Women Professionals Action Learning Team, and the Institute for Jewish Executive Leadership. Cheryl is an active member of her congregation CBE in Brooklyn, serves on the board of JPRO and on the leadership team of the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable. She holds a master's degree from Jewish Theological Seminary, another one in social work from Columbia University, and a BA from the University of Wisconsin. She lives in Brooklyn with her spouse and their 2 children. I'll also introduce Alana Kaufman, who is the executive director of the Jews of Color Initiative, which hosts the first and only philanthropic fund dedicated to Jews of color. Before joining the Jews of Color Initiative, Alana was the East Bay Public Affairs and Civic Engagement Director for the San Francisco Bay Area Jewish Community Relations Council. She also served as a program officer at the San Francisco Jewish Federation and Endowment Fund. Alana's work has been featured in the books Black Power, Jewish Politics, and Moral Resistance and Spiritual Authority. She has been featured in the Jewish Times of America and has published articles in the Forward, E-Jewish Philanthropy, and the Foundation Review. Alana is also a nationally regarded thought leader on the importance of grappling at the intersection of Jewish communities, Jewish identity, and racial justice, and has been featured on NPR's All Things Considered and Code Switch, and in the series ELI Talks, Inspired Jewish Ideas. Her talk titled Who Counts? Race and the Jewish Future has received almost 28,000 views. And Alana finally is on the Forward's 2019 list of 50 inspiring American Jews, is a senior Schusterman Fellow, received her BA in sociology from California State University Humboldt, and her master's in educational pedagogy from Mills College. I know you guys all love listening to your rap sheet as I speak. And then finally, Rabbi Jonah Dov Pesner serves as the director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. He has led the RAC since 2015. Rabbi Pesner also serves as senior VP of the Union for Reform Judaism, a position to which he was appointed in 2011. He was named one of the most influential rabbis in America by Newsweek magazine, and is an inspirational leader and tireless advocate for social justice. I can personally attest to that. Rabbi Pesner's work has focused on encouraging Jewish communities to reach across lines of race, class, and faith in campaigns for social justice. In 2006, he founded Just Congregations, which has since been incorporated into the RAC, which engage clergy, professional, and volunteer leaders in interfaith efforts in pursuit of social justice. And over the course of his career, he has led and supported campaigns for racial justice, economic opportunity, immigration reform, LGBTQ equality, human rights, and a variety of other causes. Jonah serves as a board member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, and the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, Join for Justice, and the National Religious Partnership for the Environment, and the New England Center for Children. He is a member of the leadership team of the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable, was ordained at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in 1997, was a congregational rabbi at Temple Israel in Boston and at Temple Israel in Westport, Connecticut, is a graduate of Wesleyan University and the Bronx High School of Science. And Rabbi Pesner is married to Dana Gershon, who is an attorney in New York. Woo, welcome. We are in a very illustrative community. It's very, very good to have each of you here. You each bring a lot to this work, and I'm really looking forward to a conversation about race, racial justice, Jewish identity, and the American Jewish community over the next 45 minutes or so. I'm really aware that each of us comes to this conversation from very different and distinct places and peoples, and I welcome as much of your full selves as you are able to bring to this conversation. And I thought maybe in that spirit that we would start by talking about what brings each of us here to this conversation today. And I'd like us to do this in storytelling format, good kind of organizing practice. So if you could tell a story that illustrates why you're here, why you're doing the work of racial justice. And I hope you don't mind if I'll start and share a little bit about myself and what brings me into this group. And then I will invite you to go from there. And Cheryl, I wonder if you'll be willing to go first after me. So as Shana mentioned, she was in the room with me several years ago where I kind of first dipped my toe into this particular intersection and specifically doing work of racial justice with Jewish communities. My background is growing up Catholic in the Midwest and very much in a Catholic bubble. And then I found myself in the world of faith-based community organizing, racial justice organizing, predominantly with Christian clergy. And in 2017, I think it was, I was at an interfaith event, and we thought I had helped plan this event, and it was a big social justice event, racial justice event. And we had designed it to be very deliberately multi-faith and inclusive, And in the middle of it, I thought we were doing so great. And then I got pulled aside by a group of rabbis who said, hey, we've got a problem. You all don't understand anti-Semitism. And it's really rearing its head in the space that you've tried so thoughtfully to create as interfaith and as inclusive. And I went back to my team of mostly non-Jewish clergy and organizers. And I said, hey, these rabbis are saying we have a problem. And they said, okay, you go handle it. And so I started a long journey of being in relationship with these rabbis, with other organizers across the kind of racial and religious and ethnic spectrum, trying to understand how does the Jewish community fit into the world of racial justice? What do we make of anti-Semitism? What do we make of forces like Christian dominance and Christian nationalism and Christian hegemony? And how do we understand things like white supremacy, given the complexities in this community and in many of our communities? And I have been in this world for a while and more see it as a critical piece of the work of racial justice in this country, that there is huge opportunity and potential inside of the American Jewish community, inside of my own Black Christian American community. And I'm excited to be what I hope is a little bit of a bridge builder in these spaces. So this is a little bit what brings me into this room. That group of rabbis really got me together that day and invited me down a path that I've been really honored to be able to walk since then. Cheryl, I wonder if you would take it away from there.
Thanks so much, Megan. So my parents grew up in the city of Detroit, and they lived in all Jewish neighborhoods. Their families, I mean, my grandparents were redlined as Jews and could only buy in certain areas. But at some point that changed, and Jews who were white were suddenly seen as white and given opportunities. And my parents loved the city of Detroit. They loved it. They loved their house, their neighborhood, which I heard about all the time. And they stayed put as many in the Jewish community left for the suburbs. And they stayed after the civil unrest in 1967. And they stayed until they found out that they were pregnant with me. I was born in 1969. You can now figure out my age. At that point, the center of the Jewish community had shifted. The synagogues had moved and the infrastructure no longer remained for them to raise a child immersed in Jewish community in the city of Detroit. And so they moved to the suburbs. But even after they moved, they stayed connected to the city. And so my dad would take me down to the city of Detroit regularly, every few weeks, every month, to meet with ministers who took over what were synagogues. So I would go in, we would meet with ministers and priests. We would go see the houses that my parents had grown up in and talk to the people who had moved in and talk to the neighbors. And so my parents really infused in me this connection, this desire, this need to be in relationship with people in my community, to understand that we're all part of the same humanity, that we're all obligated together. And that really, I think, has infused my desire to do this work and the work that I'm doing now.
Thanks, Cheryl. Rabbi Pesner, would you be willing to jump in?
Sure. I'm glad, first of all, I just want to say thank you to Megan Black for everything you have done and led and given the Jewish community. And I'm kind of overwhelmed with humility. Cheryl Cook is a hero of mine as well. We are in leadership together at the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable. We've been colleagues for almost 2 decades, and she's a rock star. And Alana Kaufman, you're my rabbi. Anybody that works with Alana knows the profound prophetic role she's playing in the Jewish community right now. So thank you. I'm honored to be here, and I'm grateful to Shana for convening us. Shana has ascended into leadership in the Jewish community in this philanthropic role, which is critical and urgent. And thanks to Genesis, Jill, and others for recognizing the great work of Stephen and Kate and the Righteous Person Foundation. I'm glad that, Megan, you shared that the most important part of my bio. I went to the Bronx High School of Science, really great school in a really unfortunate neighborhood. I like to say that I grew up at a wonderful Reformed Jewish synagogue in Lower Manhattan. It was the center of my life. My dad was the temple president. It was like the warm, nurturing, loving bubble. And tragedy struck when I was entering high school. My father died very suddenly, and 2 things happened. One was that the Jewish community surrounded me with love and comfort, and my rabbi was great. The sisterhood ladies were great. The youth group saved my life spiritually. And my mother became a single working mom. We lived in affordable housing, and I left the private school system to go to public schools. And God works in mysterious ways. I should have gone to Stuyvesant High School, which was the best public school 6 blocks from my house, but I didn't get in because I'm smart, but not that smart. I wound up at the best school in New York City, Bronx Science, and took the number 4 train every day from Union Square to 255th Street and Bedford Park Boulevard. And I like to say God put me on that train for a reason. I was very often the only shrimpy white Jewish kid in all black and brown environments. And for those that remember the New York of the early 1980s, it was devastated. It was literally a community that had been abandoned, that was devastated, that was so utterly poor and had its back human beings suffering in just reprehensible poverty and despair and a kind of plague of crime and drug use. And the New York City law enforcement kind of just turned their backs. And I found a grinding disconnect between the gap between the articulated values of my synagogue, what my rabbis preached, what the Reformed Jewish movement said it stood for, and the utter abandonment of the human beings I saw living in the South Bronx, some of whom wound up getting on the train, sitting next to me in math class. And so I devoted my rabbinate to challenging the Jewish community to act on its 5,000-year-old set of values as contained in our sacred scriptures and rabbinic wisdom.
Thank you for sharing. Alana?
Sure. Pardon me. Good morning. Good afternoon to my Eastern colleagues out there. Thank you all for convening us, Megan, for hosting us in this way, and Joan and Cheryl, it's great to be with you. And I just want to give a shout out to Victoria Rags out there and the Fulcher family out there. I see you, and I just want to give you all some respect for being one of our most generational Jewish families of color in the United States, and for all the work, Victoria, that you're carrying for the community. And so I just want to give a shout out. I grew up in San Francisco, California, and since Cheryl started us off, I was born in 1972, which is important because it's the edge of the Vietnam War, it's the edge of the Black Power movement, it's the edge of the Civil Rights movement, and I grew up in the Western Addition of San Francisco, where I didn't know there were not Black Jewish people until I went to synagogue. And I would walk up the hill from the 6 blocks from my house in the Western Addition to my synagogue, Sheriff Israel, and a community of 2,000 people, and there were only 5 people of color. And anytime we asked a question about why there weren't people who looked like us, I was met with confusion, as if the entire container and paradigm in which the US Jewish world exists only understood itself as white. Fast forward into this work at the Jews of Color Initiative, and I want to sort of like create a tiny frame, which is, how could the US Jewish community not be multiracial and multi-ethnic in a context where the entire physics of the United States is to be multiracial? And so we have to ask ourselves, what is it that's made us think of ourselves as all white and kind of operate as all white in a context where the science and the data only tells us that's impossible, right? And in a context where we are existing in a space of disbelief, which is informed by kind of fiction, right? There have been Jews of color in the United States since the 1600s. In the late 1600s and 1700s, 10% of the US Jewish community were people of color. And so the question becomes, how did we begin to understand ourselves as all white? What's the role of racism in participating in this myth of whiteness? And then what's at cost and what's at stake for the US Jewish community? We are already somewhere between 8 and 15% people of color. We're only 2% of the US population. 20% of our families are multiracial, and every day those numbers get bigger. Something like 20% of our young people ages 0 to 18 are non-white. So this is not an intellectual exercise, right? This is not about when we will be multiracial. This is about when we will realize ourselves as multiracial. And when we get there, the exciting things happen, right? We get to understand, what does it mean to be in our power as a multiracial Jewish community? What does it mean to coalesce around this power and then be in relationship with other movement partners out there? What does it mean to be able to commingle and co-mesh in a context where we collectively have the skills of anti-racism? And that's what this conversation invites. I'm so excited to have it with Rabbi Jonah and Cheryl and Megan. And I want to thank the Genesis Foundation and Shana and Jill for making this happen. It's good to see everybody.
Thanks, Alana. I do a lot of training on racial justice and the story of race. And the first moving people and moving congregations into organizing work, into justice making work. And early on in those training series, I always do a session around the story of race in this country, the one we've been told and the one that we are kind of uncovering and rewriting. And I'm curious about, from your perspective, what you see as what's the narrative shift that needs to happen? I'm picking up a little bit from what you just said, Alana. I think there's an existing story about race in the American Jewish community and racial justice. And from where each of you sit, what needs to change? What has changed about that story? Where do you see that fitting into your work right now? Anyone want to take it away?
I mean, I'll take a bite, but Jonah and Cheryl, like, I'm looking at you. I think that, I'll just say my mother's parents came from Poland and Romania. And I remember growing up in a context where my mother always identified as white, but not that kind of white. And what she meant was not the kind of white where she was to be associated or aligned with people who were anti-Semitic and who marginalized Jews and other people from Eastern European backgrounds. And I think in the context of moving into a country, at least for many people in the United States who are both of Ashkenazi descent and Jewish, the container has been one of us running from anti-Semitism, finding ways to protect ourselves and keep ourselves safe, which is essential and vital in a context where anti-Semitism will always exist. And we need to thumbtack. That's why we need to be in movement, a partnership with other people. And in the container, we have created a context, kind of a self-fulfilling context, where when we project everybody who we think are US Jews as white, we then begin to believe the narrative that Jews are white. And it's really important, I think, when you study US history to understand for people who are white to ascend in the United States, because people from Irish descent were not white, people from Armenia, from Greece were not white, Italians were not white. There was a choice that people had to make to participate in moving into whiteness. And part of that choice was about protecting Jews and giving Jews the tools to become self-sufficient and ascend in the US Jewish community. But there was a cost to that choice. And that cost was those tools of privilege and ascension were not offered to Black and brown people. And when we separate ourselves from Black and brown people, not realizing we are Black and brown people, we both then accept those tools of whiteness and power and privilege, and there's a cost at the same time. And until we start to really understand the choices we've made and the costs and make repair for that, it gets in the way of us progressing as a national community, both as US Jews and Jews in partnership with all of our allies and siblings out there.
I really want to build on, Alana, what you just said, because I started with the story about the Jewish community moving out of Detroit, and certainly, or white Jews moving out of Detroit. And certainly that is a story that I think is replicated in cities across our country. And so I didn't go deeper, but to go deeper, right? What happened was people who were looking for opportunity were suddenly allowed to move into neighborhoods that were Jewish. These were Jewish neighborhoods. People were allowed to move in, and Black and brown people started moving into neighborhoods. And real estate brokers started knocking on doors and saying, your house is gonna, lose value. Your house is about to lose value, you gotta move. And people took the bait. And I think it's a moment in our Jewish history that we actually have to really reflect on and hold and do some tshuva for, because it is a sad moment in our history where many Jewish communities abandoned cities or abandoned neighborhoods because of fear. And again, Alana, I think you said it really beautifully. There's a lot of anti-Semitism in our history as Jews, and we have to hold that, and it's true. And there was a lot of fear that racism and all the things that we all hold as a country was there, but my grandparents and many others left the communities. And so I think that there's really something there now, as there are Jewish communities in cities now and in suburbs now, that we have to see ourselves as multicultural and multi-ethnic and really hold that is such a strength of ours as a community. It's an incredible strength. And I just feel like this coming back and understanding our history and telling that story differently than we've told it before is really a huge part of really being able to rebuild who we are now and hold the strength of who we are now.
Amen to both of what you've said, Cheryl. Great story. And in full disclosure, Alana guides the work of the Religious Action Center and the Union for Reform Judaism and our anti-racism work, and attempt to kind of live in the space that Alana just described. So I preface what I'm about to say. You know, the Reform Jewish movement, which counts both Cheryl and Alana as members of two of our best congregations. I love all my congregations equally, but you both belong to wonderful ones. You know, there's more than 2 million people who call themselves Reform Jews. And if you look carefully at the data that Ilana has time and again brought forward, on the one hand, we're the largest and most diverse denomination in Jewish life. On the other hand, we do not reflect the multiracial reality of the United States of America. And Alana once in a very good agitational moment challenged me a few years ago and said, so if the Reform Jewish movement is so inclusive of interfaith families, let's say, if so many LGBTQIA folks have found a home in Reform Judaism, why are the Black and brown Jews not finding a home in the Reform Jewish movement? It's racism. And I just want to invite everybody on the Zoom, and I'm looking at the squares. I love so many people I'm seeing on the Zoom, like, take a deep breath with me. Racism. Like, it's hard as a white Jewish liberal to acknowledge that maybe we do have a racism problem, that like when the kid finishes his bar mitzvah and comes off the bima and is handed a tray to serve because he looks more like Alana than like me, that's racism. Or the vice president of a synagogue who comes every week, but every week when she comes is welcomed by the greeters who rotate like once a year and say, what brings you here tonight? And she's like, I'm the vice president of this synagogue and you are interrogating me because I don't look like you. We have a racism problem. And there are so many stories, and there's such an inclination to be like, well, there's a reason, there's an explanation. For those of us who are like me, who are white Jews, this journey has been about lots and lots of cheshbon nefesh, an accounting for the soul, and the teshuva that Cheryl described, to ask, in what ways are we complicit with white supremacy in the synagogue? Like, in other words, the structural dynamics that Cheryl laid out that lead to a community that does not look like or act like what it says its values are, right? There's this beautiful theological imperative in an incredible midrash that says God created the first human out of like white sand and black loam and yellow clay and all the colors of the earth, so that we would know the theological imperative that no human who looks different or is different in color is different than others. And yet we have allowed white supremacy to kind of seep into who we are. If the ancient rabbis understood this, then it's something that I think we can really do the hard work to understand, as at least as white Jews.
One thing I heard, Alana, in your comment was that there is this need for a reckoning around, and Jonah, I'm hearing the same thing from each of you, but I'm thinking about the story you told, Jonah, about this tension you noticed between the values that you were exposed to in your synagogue growing up and what you saw when you moved to the Bronx high school. And I wonder if we can talk a little bit about the reckoning and the need for it. Do we see it happening yet? Is it not happening? What might it look like? And maybe the other piece of this conversation is, you know, to what extent, how do we think about racial justice and Jewish values? And how, like, what's the narrative that you're trying to move around how we consider these two things? Because there is an ongoing, like, oh, part of what I'm seeing is racial justice is a Jewish value. And what I'm also hearing from you is, well, that if it is, why isn't it more of a thing? Why haven't we yet dealt with our racism? Why haven't we yet dealt with whiteness? So I wonder if you could each just share, how do you make sense of this, this reckoning?
I love that question, and I'll take a bite. So many of you know, like, I'm trained as a classroom teacher. My master's is in educational pedagogy. So I think about like design and like delivery of content all of the time, and it totally lights me up. And I was working with one of our colleague foundations who focus strictly on education. And they asked me sort of a similar question, but about the classroom space. And so the way I want to respond to your question, Megan, and the energy I want to bring is like, as a teacher, I don't get it, right? Like, I don't get why we in the US as a Jewish community haven't stepped back and sort of shed, to Jonah's point around the midrash, like, we were all designed to have the capacity to recognize and hold difference and racial difference. And as part of the US community, we also have been designed to not only participate in racism, but to benefit from it, to oppress other people. And I say this in kind of a dispassionate way, like as if I were an attorney just delivering some content to you. Because I don't think we should get so excited or agitated by the fact that we all participate and foment and perpetuate racism. Right? Like we live in the US, like that is the air we breathe. That has been what we've been designed to do. And that is how we have been set up to succeed and fail. I want to get excited about the fact that we know this, right? We have awareness about this, and we have the tools and the capacity as Jews through content, through value, through Torah, through being smart folks who are great problem solvers, for being people who care about equity, about justice, about change. Like we have all the tools to respond to these questions and to respond to these problems. And I think we have as a Jewish community to understand what will it mean to give up some privilege, right? And these are privileges that have been unearned. They have been assigned to folks because of how they are perceived. What does it mean to create space in the US Jewish community for folks who are part of communities of color? And how do we do that in a way that's authentic? I don't worry about Judaism being diluted. Like we've survived more than 5,000 years and all our iterations, we will be fine. And as a US Jewish community, if we don't get this part right, it means that Kalal Yisrael domestically will fail. Right? Because this train has left the station. And so I view it as like one of the most exciting problem-solving challenges we have. We are here to struggle for the sake of heaven. And it should not get us down, it should lift us up.
Yeah, I thank you, Alana. I would just, can I build on that, Megan, a little bit?
Yes,
you said before, Megan, that racial justice is a Jewish value. I want to say Black Lives Matter is a Jewish value. I want to let that just sit with folks for a minute. And I invite for folks to go to the RAC website and see some deep reflections from lots of Jews of color and lots of white Jews about why Black Lives Matter is a Jewish value. We have a prominent Zionist who talks about why Black Lives Matter as a Zionist is a Jewish value. We have Black and brown Jews talking about it. And I think it gets at what part of the problem is, right? What white supremacy looks like is trying to divide communities when people have experienced depression and been marginalized. And so one of the tools is to pit the white Jewish community that's afraid for the anti-Semitism, which is real. Cheryl said it earlier, it's been violent of late. And then use that as a weapon to pit us against other marginalized community. And for those who are Black and brown in the Jewish community, that is not an option, right? For LGBTQIA Jews, that is not an option. For disabled Jews, that is not an option. And so many other marginalized communities. And so I just think it's really important to kind of take a deep breath and, you know, ask the question again that I was asking earlier, which is to what extent does my fear or does my own internalized racism allow me to become weaponized? Another good example is critical race theory. Like, I'm just gonna put that out there. There are forces in the Jewish community that are suddenly using for partisan political purposes this really important way of thinking about the universe that actually centers the experience of Black Americans, of the descendant of African slaves, and what the systems of racism for 400 years have led us to, which just asks us to have an honest accounting. But then suddenly that gets weaponized, and against the Jewish community in particular, to kind of say to the white Jewish community, choose. Are you on this side or are you on that side? It feels anti-Jewish to me and anti-intellectual for sure.
Yeah, one of my, my work and the way this has evolved is I was very much organizing around criminal justice reform, immigration reform, things like that, all issues I still care about very deeply. But I became clearer and clearer that there's a narrative and a story about anti-Semitism that is deeply misunderstood, and that I think is actually a real threat, not just to the Jewish community, but to the kind of broader, my own Black American community. And the fact that it's misunderstood and makes it easy to be weaponized, and it becomes a force of division like what you're talking about. And so I have been doing a lot of work. I work with Western states and are particularly in the world of white nationalism. But I am very curious about, and I think, events of the last several months have revealed that there is an ongoing conversation that needs to happen about how we understand anti-Semitism in the context of white supremacy. And I wonder I didn't quite prepare you for this question, but I wonder if you'd be willing to tackle what is the conversation about anti-Semitism that you want to be having right now? Because there's a lot of different conversations we could be having on this. I'm particularly interested in the one that we have that helps us make sense of white supremacy and anti-Blackness, and I think there is a really rich conversation there. I'm curious for each of you, if we have time, what's the conversation about anti-Semitism that you'd like to be having?
I mean, I'll start and I'll just say, I mean, I think anti-Semitism is used by the powerful to distract, right? The Jews, it's the Jews who are we're scapegoated. We're scapegoated all the time. It's the Jews who are controlling the world. It's all the kind of tropes about anti-Semitism are really used to distract from what's really going on. And so I think that conversation about how anti-Semitism is used to distract is really important for us to talk about, so that we can really see that we don't want to keep propping up white supremacy. We want to actually understand the difference between anti-Semitism, between racism, right? Racism is about oppression or benefits, right? Race is used as to benefit groups or to oppress groups, which is different than anti-Semitism, which is used to kind of scapegoat. You get a little bit of privilege, and you then kind of sit in that privilege and can hold up the power. And I just think, and I think Eric Ward at Western States has really written some beautiful pieces about it. I urge everyone to read Skin Deep. I can't remember the full title, but Megan, I'm sure you know it. In the game. Really beautiful writing about this. And I just think that we need to really look at that and understand the difference. And I also just want to name that I think that there's real opportunity. We have, my nephew is Black and Jewish, and we have, as Alana said, so many, Black Jews, especially as, the younger generation. My nephew's 21 years old. He's on the edge of that 20%. We have people who are living with both and who really can be our thought leaders already, are our thought leaders to help us take apart and build up some of the blind spots that I've had as a white Jew growing up in this country. I'm really excited about the opportunity.
Right on, right. And I think I would just add, and again, I always kind of come at it from this classroom place, but I mean, I remember reading The Grapes of Wrath in school as a young person and it really not resonating with me. And then somebody sort of saying, like, think about your family history. And it was not my classroom teacher. I was like an all white gifted classroom where they were not making anything relevant. And someone had to sit me down after, and I think I had watched Grapes of Wrath on the PBS, and then drew out of me my own family's experience. And I offer this as an example to say this. Anti-Semitism has to be, and understanding anti-Semitism and responding to anti-Semitism has to be taught the same way we teach anti-racism, the same way we teach to be, anti-homophobic, the same way we teach to be open to people with different abilities. These are literacies that we need to have. And I think in the US Jewish community, we overestimate how much people know about Jews, Judaism, Israel, Jewish identity. And I kind of want to say, like, why would anybody know anything, right? Like, when you think about the comprehensive public school education system, when you think about that 96% of US people go to public schools, when you think about what people are learning, where would we learn about Jews, Judaism, and Israel? And so how do we understand how to teach these themes for all the young people? And how do we do it in a way that understands our young people, like Cheryl's nephew, come from backgrounds where in order to understand the experience of Jews, they need to understand their own experience, right? Because their families have fled places too. Their families have experienced genocide too. Their families have been indentured servants and laborers too. And so their worldview is different. And so we need to look at our colleagues, for example, like Facing History and ourselves, who have helped people understand Holocaust education through a lens that makes it relevant to other stories, because other people's stories are really important too. And the last thing I want to say is, this is not a competition, and we cannot create a structure where people are in competition to understand anti-Semitism. My daughter, who's 15 and a half, deserves to know her history as a Jewish person, as a Black person, as a woman. And she can hold all of that. And when she can hold all of that, she understands anti-Semitism better. And so how do we do that for everybody so that everybody understands anti-Semitism, not at the cost of their own identity, but it elevates everybody's understanding and builds community around that understanding?
That's great. I'm getting some questions about kind of issues that are specific to congregational life. So I'm going to try to maybe come back to those, but I do, given the setting that we're in, I do want to talk a little bit about philanthropy and Jewish philanthropy in particular. And each of you has extensive experience in this world. There has been, at least from my perspective, a shift toward really wanting, from the funders I work with, really seeing an interest in throwing down on racial justice. And there's obviously room for growth and development and conversation. And I'm curious to hear from you what your kind of hot take is on the world of Jewish philanthropy right now. Specifically, where do you see like really great, like where are you excited? What are you excited about what's going on? And where are you like, okay, a little more work needs to happen here? And Jonah, Jonah,
I can jump in. I mean, first of all, I see on the Zoom some of the most generous funders in the Jewish social justice space are on this Zoom. So I don't want to out you all because, you have different levels of anonymity and public recognition. But as Alana said earlier, I see you and we know you're here. Thank you for showing up. And then I think there's some funders on the Zoom that I'm seeing that are like trying to figure it out. So I think my two observations, one is that there was a big push over the last 18 months because of the pandemic and the crisis. Like the URJ had to close 16 summer camps, losing $40 million in revenue in 1 year. Like that is a catastrophe for the Jewish people, right? Think of all those young people who missed the camp experience and all the things we couldn't do because of the loss of revenue. Synagogues trying to figure out how to go on Zoom, like the layoffs, people directly impacted by the pandemic, which was, by the way, the racial disparities that emerged as an overlay, right? And then the funding community came in and said, we need to give emergency help. And wanted to do some catalytic transformational investments. And I was surprised by the number of those funders who, when I said, then we need to double down on racial justice, equity, and inclusion in the Jewish community, because that is the single biggest challenge. That is the unreconciled business of the Jewish community in America today. And they looked at me with a blank stare like, oh no, that's our racial equity portfolio, which is like this pocket of money over here. Go talk to Alana because we give it to Alana. So I'm like, I don't want to be mean about it. I want to ask people just to step back and ask, like, really? If Alana's right in laying out the huge gap between what the Jewish community looks like and the multiracial reality and our values, why wouldn't we do a Marshall Plan of confronting racism and injustice within the synagogue? Which, by the way, remember earlier when Alana said it won't water down Judaism? I'm going to put a stake in the ground. It might actually transform synagogues and Jewish education to be compelling, joyful places that kids want to be. Because we'd have to say, like, what would actually engage and turn people on to Judaism so they want to be there and want to belong. And then the second observation that I would just make is I'm seeing on the Zoom funders who fund like our racial justice advocacy work, like, on a state and federal level because they do policy. And then the other funders who are like, oh no, we're not political. We want you to do internal anti-racism work with the synagogues, as if people don't realize that like racism is in the oxygen we breathe as Americans. And if we don't dismantle racism in the study I am sitting in the town that I live in the synagogue that I go to, in the state and in the country, we got to do it all. So those are my two loving observations of the funding community.
I'll just add two things. One is that 5 years ago, when you remember the summer, the movement for Black Lives, it was a big summer. Avodah decided we wanted to do racial justice work internally at that moment. And I went to multiple funders asking for, I don't know, it was $15,000 to really just do some internal work. And I felt like I was nobody was hearing me. It felt really hard. I actually didn't raise the money. I did the work anyway on a shoestring internally. And it felt really hard. It felt really hard because it felt like it wasn't a priority in our Jewish community. And I have seen a huge sea change. So I really want to honor that because I love moments of sea change and I want to push them farther. And so, yes, there's been a sea change. I see incredible projects popping up in the community. We are running a Jews of Color Buy It, and we actually were able to raise money for it this year. And that was so exciting. And I think the things I'd love to see are we get a lot when we fill out grant reports, write a lot about our outcomes, where are we, but nobody ever asks us about pay equity. Nobody asks us what kind of work have we done to actually move forward a racial justice work as an organization. And I would love to see some of that coming out from, right? I think the funder community has incredible leverage to help impact organizations on the ground in the Jewish community. And I just want to urge that. And I'm happy to be part of a think tank to help think about what that could look like and what would be hard and what would be easy, but I want to get there because I think there's real opportunity.
Right on. I think I would add that, so at the initiative, we do run the country's only philanthropic fund focused on Jewish people of color, and we raise that money from the community. And so I just want to explain how that works. And we try to do everything we do through a lens that's informed by racial equity and justice, which means that we do our work differently than most foundations and most funds in the country. And I think our grantees and our colleagues would attest to that experience. And so what I want to say is this. Like in the philanthropic community, particularly in the Jewish space, and I'm just going to say this out loud, where there is no accountability. And what I mean by that is it's not like all the funders, myself, our organization included, roll up to some organization of standards of excellence, right? Like we only roll up to ourselves. And that's wonderful. And also it's a little bit scary because we have to hold each other accountable to being excellent and having integrity and doing righteous work. And so that means the invitation is to apply lenses of racial equity and justice, quite frankly, of equity and justice to everything we do in the philanthropic and funding community, and invite the conversation about what it means to do our work differently. What would look different if we applied equity and justice lenses? How would we make repair for the inequity and the injustice that's been perpetuated for so many decades in our community? What's been the cost? What is the opportunity, and where do we get to go together? And so I'm really interested in, with the colleagues, nudging, pushing, gently nudging, having these conversations, talking about accountability. To Jonah's point, talking about why our funding portfolios are essentially racially segregated, right? Like there's a community engagement work and then there's the justice work, but isn't that the same? Like if people like experience justice, would they be more engaged? And so I'm interested in really applying these lenses with some rigor, having very honest, quality conversations, and pushing ourselves to create not only new outcomes, but accountability to those outcomes.
I wonder if there's something in particular that you are, well, let's maybe take the next few minutes to share a little bit more about the work that you're each doing and how you, in your organizations, as leaders of your organizations, are moving forward racial justice imperatives and where you see that fitting into the kind of overall mission of your organization.
I mean, I'll just start maybe because it should be easy. So the Jewish Color Initiative, we are here in service to the entire Jewish communal ecosystem, and we focus on Jewish people of color. So that's our thing. That's what we do. And that means we focus on the 20% of multiracial Jewish families in the community space. We focus on every organization, every foundation, every Hillel, every colleague out there, because we are here for the ecosystem. Our perspective, and I said this kind of by way of framing, is the US Jewish community has to come to terms with ourselves as being multiracial, and we have to develop skills of not even being, I mean, never mind being tolerant. Like I don't want to be tolerated. I mean, I want to be tolerated by my 15-year-old, but beyond that, I don't want to be tolerated. I want to be whole, right? I want to thrive, and I want everybody else to thrive. Like we are here for everyone to win, but we cannot win unless we're countercultural in a context that has rewarded people for racism and rewarded people for unearned privilege. And we can't understand that if we don't talk about it. And we can't talk about it if we're not in relationship. And we can't be in relationship unless we're not having conversations about it and doing that in a way that commits to each other that we want to be whole and we want to get through this together. And so like, that's how we think about our work. The way we express it is through grant money. And so like, go to our website, let us know if you want to have that conversation. We do that by commissioning research. And so on August 12th and in this fall, we will be rolling out our next study, giving you the results of surveying more than 1,000 Jewish people of color in the United States. And we do that by doing education, and we don't do diversity training. We're terrible at it. What we do is talk about paradigm shift. What we do is design our ways into the future And I'm excited to be able to design our ways into the future with all of you.
Thanks, Ilana. Cheryl, would you be willing to pick up?
Happily, happily. So I'm the CEO of Avodah, and at Avodah, we're investing in emerging and current Jewish leaders to build Jewish social justice leaders. And I think the thing that I really think about is that social justice education is Jewish education. I really believe they have to be tied together much more. It's not separate. We really need to tie this together. And so at Avodah, we run a Jewish service corps. Like a Peace Corps, like an AmeriCorps, but for Jews, for young Jews. And so right now, we're recruiting 21 to 26-year-olds who want to work on the pressing issues in our country. We're opening a new site in San Diego to work on immigration, and we're working on criminal justice, and we're working on many, many other issues. And it's an opportunity for young people as they're figuring out who they are in their careers to come spend a year in a Jewish context to do social justice work, to learn to be in Jewish community and to do this work. So if you know young people, we have another month and a half till we start our program, but don't know what they're doing, they should come to us. And we're also going to be launching a Jewish Justice Institute to train up current leaders in Jewish organizations. We've been doing a lot of internal work at Avodah around learning, and we're still on a journey about how to be an anti-racist organization, how to do our own work better. And we want to help, as we're doing this work, train up and help move our larger Jewish community, our beloved Jewish community, in this direction as well, with the Jewish justice education that we've been doing for 23 years. So it is an exciting moment. I have seen so much hungering for these conversations like today, and I'm excited to really help move that forward.
Thanks, Cheryl. Jonah, and then I want to make a final observation as we close out. So Jonah, please go ahead.
Well, so as this is my last word, again, gratitude, praise, blessings to the Holy One who created us all and to the great people doing this great work. In that spirit, I want to acknowledge this will be the art site of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner. I name them not in a moment of nostalgia of the kind of old binary of Black Jewish, but the sacredness of their task. They didn't die for voting rights for nothing. They were ultimately about racial justice and the intersectionality of solidarity and democracy, all of which is to say our priority at the Reformed Jewish movement, having shown up 60 years ago during a different inflection point in American history. We're all in on a racial justice campaign. We have sought to mobilize 2 million Reformed Jews in service of true racial justice in the United States of America and in Canada. And it has 3 pillars. Pillar number 1 is the work that Alana Kaufman is catalyzing. It is to congregation by congregation, youth group by youth group, summer camp by summer camp, to truly be anti-racist communities, to do the training and the hard work, and to confront the question at a very grassroots level. How are we complicit with racism? How can we become the multiracial, truly inclusive, truly diverse, and equitable communities that we want to be? Which means, like Cheryl's congregation in Brooklyn, the great Rabbi Rachel Timoner, looking at reparations and the building that they live in. Like, that's just a good example where public policy overlaps with anti-racism within the community or the institution. The second pillar is statewide organizing. The RAC has 9 state projects. Each one of them, God bless the great state of Texas. I know people are worried about voter suppression in Texas. We just had a win. The Reformed Jewish community was instrumental in the interfaith multiracial coalition that gave the Democrats courage to walk out and not let the voter suppression bill. And then finally, the last pillar is federal policy. And I can't not lift this up at this moment because the Senate just did what we all knew they would do in a, because of the filibuster, voted against voting rights, which is an abomination. And if anybody wonders about the urgency of S1 and voting rights and democracy, it was just a few months ago that white supremacist, Confederate waving, racist thugs staged an insurrection or rebellion and invaded the United States Capitol, which is just a few blocks from where I am. And they wore anti-Semitic t-shirts. If you ever wonder whether our safety comes in our solidarity and our redemption as a nation will come through our democracy, it was on full display. So get involved, do anti-racism work where you live, get involved in a statewide campaign, and fight for the democracy of our country.
A beautiful note to end on. I really appreciate each of you sharing your wisdom and your stories. And to those of you who participated in the group chat and sent questions, thank you so much for sharing what's on your mind. I'm mindful of I was noticing a lot of the questions coming through, many of which deal with how do we navigate interpersonal dynamics when it comes to race. And I think there's a conversation to be had about here's who we are in our professional lives, and here's how I show up personally, interpersonally, in my congregation, in my community, in my neighborhood, et cetera. And so I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of conversations around anti-racism and racial justice that need to happen. And I'm really grateful to each of you for the work that you're doing on a really deep and relational level in your organizations. Really excited to continue to move forward with you. Jill, will you take us away?
I will indeed. Megan, thank you so much for moderating what was a really fascinating conversation. Thank you to our three panelists for doing such important work and sharing just a bit of that with us today. A reminder that a recording of this panel will be on the JTA website, and there will be a write-up in the coming days about this important conversation on JTA. On behalf of the Genesis Prize Foundation, we want to thank Steven Spielberg for his commitment to social justice. We're happy to join him in shining light on the work you all do and our other grantees do. And I want to remind you that on July 6th, we will begin accepting nominations for the next Genesis Prize laureate. So follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and nominate someone who has extraordinary professional accomplishments, who's committed to humanity, and who actually lives their Jewish values. So we will send you a link, and it's a thank you for the webinar. You look for a link in your mailbox to be able to nominate. And again, thank you all for a terrific conversation, and thank you for joining us and sharing the work.